Welcome back to Beyond the Text with me, Samuel Woodall.
And me, Jack Thomson.
Fantastic. Perfect timing, even though, once again, the international jet setter has set off to our Dutch sisterland. How is it over there, Jack?
It's very sunny. In my dag.
You're a little bit too early for the tulips, though. That's a couple of weeks, isn't it?
No, I think I'm actually arrived just in time.
Oh, really? They're blooming?
I think they're starting to. If not the tulips, there were some other flowers here which are definitely blooming. I think like dandelions, for instance. I've seen a few of them, and other very nice flowers, snowflakes and so forth. Not snowflakes, but the flower that they're called snowflakes. you know the type.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, so you're having a good time. And what have you been studying whilst you've been there?
Well, we ran some seminars on health and healing, which are more theologically oriented. That was really great fun. And then I'm just staying around because I have a seminar tomorrow evening on Plato's Protagoras. And so we finished that last week, Plato's Meno, which is the
Meno from the five dialogues.
Yeah, I don't know what they count in the five dialogues, but
I think Meno is in there.
I think it's quite an important one, and generally it is one that most people have read. It's the dialogue about Socrates and the slave boy.
Ah, yes, yeah. I think. I mean, there's so many different compilations of the works of Plato, and you get the Trial of Socrates, but you also get the Life and Trial of Socrates. That's one compilation, and that I think integrates maybe a few of the five.
Yeah, but that doesn't have the Meno. That has
no, I don't think it does.
The Crito, the Phaedo, the Apology, and the Eusipro, I think. Those four.
Yeah. And I think in my Classics Club reader one, I think the Symposium's included as well.
Oh, really? Wow.
I think. Anyway, we're not talking about Plato today, but we are on the topic of heritage. And if you haven't listened to it already, you can go back and listen to our session on Plato. But today we're going to be talking about Edmund Burke, and then we'll be going on to a later period in history, which is the English Romantics, to perhaps seeming very different contexts. But I think what we'll try to show is the link through in this English heritage tradition that we've been discussing, and we'll try and sort of draw some interesting parallels and maybe some interesting connections between the two groupings. But we're going to begin with Edmund Burke. So Jack, your area of expertise, we've covered this, as you've just said before, quite a few times in terms of bringing up Burke. Who exactly was Edmund Burke, and why does he still matter today? And why is he still influential today is maybe a better question, whether or not he matters. But why is he still influential today? Why is he often cited? And yeah, give us some insight into his life and what he was doing.
Yeah, always great pleasure. I'm very much a fan of Burke's work. I think he represents a kind of conservatism which you don't really find in the public domain so much anymore. And partly because of changes in the second half of the 20th century, a move on the right towards a centrism and an economic vision, which was then only masquerading as conservatism. In many ways, it's really just libertarianism, which is fine, but it's not what conservatism traditionally meant. It's given it a bit of a bad name, I think.
Yeah, no, completely.
So, Edmund Burke. So he's his life spanned basically the majority of the 18th century. He was born in 1729, raised in Dublin with a Catholic mother and a Protestant father. He received an education at Trinity College Dublin, a Protestant university, and continued to practice his father's Anglican faith all his life. His first manuscript was A Vindication of Natural Society, published in 1752. So he was 23 years old. And it was written in imitation of the style of the late Lord Bolingbroke. He was trying there to challenge Bolingbroke's arguments against revealed religion. And Burke's sense was that if you don't have a rational account of revealed religion, neither do you have an account of society.
Mm,
Because for Burke, society and civic institutions aren't rationally founded. They are much like we did a series on liberty, and we discussed Hayek, and Hayek had this idea that society, the logic of society and its inner growth and constitution was something implicit, was something that no person had a total perspective on. In some sense, it's just lost in time and history.
yeah.
And so you never have a full enough understanding of a state to reform it to perfection. And Burke takes this view very much. So
And he
society
focuses on the intergenerationality of it, doesn't he? That these things are a discussion. Doesn't he say something like, these things are a discussion between the living and the dead, in a sense?
Yeah, exactly. That's already a window into the call it the supra-rational element of society. It's bound to time.
Yeah.
And it's understood more in a logic of inheritance and obligation and responsibility than it is about just merely abstract discourse on rights, for example. Okay. So at the age of 24, so I think a year later, he wrote a short treatise on aesthetics. 4 years later, that was published with very minimal edits, and that is the philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. They identified and critiqued Plato's idea that beauty consisted in proportion. And Burke basically thought that this idea had just influenced all of the treatises on aesthetics since Baumgarten at the turn of the 18th century, and he wanted to put forward the contrary view, in effect to broaden our notion of beauty, that it's not just this limited sort of geometrical sense, but it's also it involves a very sensible element. It involves feelings of being overwhelmed by the gravity and immensity of things in the world. That's he distinguishes sublimity and beauty. They're not interchangeable words. Because on the basis of these two publications, but especially the philosophical inquiry, he gained notoriety in London, and he was invited there to found and edit a journal on international affairs called the Annual Register. He then took up a role as pamphleteer to the Whigs, writing on various controversies from the impending American Revolution to the debates on constitutional limits of power, concerning James II and events around his his reign.
George II.
Oh yes, but I think the question had come into focus, particularly with the Stuart line, and obviously you had the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
Yeah.
And that I think reflection on that event seemed to have been something, quite important to Burke's intellectual development.
Similar to who I look at in terms of Rapin writing after the Stuart time, but certainly, reflecting on the sort of tendency towards tyranny that the historians of this period saw associated with the Stuarts having obviously then been kicked out.
Yes, exactly. So on this basis, Burke essentially established for himself a very lengthy career in politics, culminating in an election as MP for Malton, which is near York, and that was in 1780, and then later in Bristol, 14 years later. Now, Burke's always had a connection to France. In his youth, he stayed in France for 3 months, and he took a lifelong interest in their culture and politics. When his friend, the French aristocrat Charles Jean-Francois de Pont, wrote to Burke to ask for his thoughts on the storming of the Bastille in 89, Burke responded in 2 letters, and it was the second of those which became the Reflections on the Revolution in France. Um, it would it was important for Burke to publish this letter publicly because he realized that what was going on in France was intimately connected to the English situation.
Mm.
The most radical wing of his own party, the Whigs, were responding to the events in France, and arguing that, in effect, what the French were enacting is the logical consequence of our own glorious revolution. That we should have our own French Revolution in order to finish the glorious
Finish the
revolution of
job. Yeah.
1688. And the chief pamphleteer of that movement was Richard Price. And Burke spent the first 100 pages, I think, of the reflection talking about Price's letter and this talk that he gave to select members of the Whig group. And he pulls apart the talk systematically. Particularly, it basically critiques its interpretation of the events of 1688 and the constitution that was the fruits of that.
Mm. Mm.
And so in this criticism, which we can go into in more detail shortly, you see essentially the core tenets of Burkean conservatism. So Burke finally composed that letter about 4 months after the storming of the Bastille. He goes on to, in that letter, to reflect on the rationalist principles underlying the French Revolution and critiques them vehemently. And the product is a 400-page pamphlet addressed to the English audience, reproving Republican sentiment. And the pamphlet was an instant success, selling 13,000 copies in the first 5 weeks, which I think must have been pretty unprecedented for the time. And it was reprinted 11 times before the following September, which is also pretty incredible. That's like 9 months.
And he wrote it incredibly quickly as well. I had something somewhere in my notes that he wrote it in just a few months.
Exactly, yes. He wrote it in, I think, in 4 months.
Wow.
All 400 pages.
And yeah, it sold 13,000 copies in 5 weeks. That is just phenomenal. Phenomenal. Yeah. Although, when Thomas Paine comes to publish his Rights of Man, that sells hundreds of thousands of copies. Not that I'm getting competitive here. We've already had the reluctant Painist and the devout Burkean.
Never mind. I can't argue with that. Other than to say that maybe was that the American audience or was that the English audience?
I guess both.
Okay.
So a larger pool of people and a shorter pamphlet, so not necessarily so engrossing a read as hard to publish as Burke's Reflections.
Okay.
But yeah, no, that's very interesting, Jack. And yeah, I think we've sort of covered his early life there. I don't know if there was anything else other than one thing that I think should be noted with the popularity of sort of post-colonial lenses today. What's interesting about Burke as a figure now praised on the right is that he was very much a critic of the imperial project. He was part of a generation of politicians who he would prosecute Warren Hastings, the governor of Bengal, for 9 years. We might come to this a little bit later in terms of his involvement.
Yes, that's an interesting episode.
But it is interesting that his politics sits awkwardly when it comes to political narratives and like political studies narratives that try to encapsulate ideologies. And again, this is why we do it much more in a conceptual way in terms of what we're doing. But he doesn't sit neatly within our kind of left-right political lenses necessarily that we use today. And I think, yeah, we've sort of covered his early intellectual work, unless there's anything else, Jack, that you'd like to say about the sublime and beauty, whether there's anything. I mean, I've just got sort of the general distinction of beauty as the harmony, the smoothness, the proportion, the sublime being terror, power, the vastness of it all, and overwhelming emotion. and the idea that this challenged, you're better placed than me, Jack, in terms of your philosophical understanding, but challenged classical ideas, that beauty equals proportion.
Yeah, I think in terms of a textbook look, I think the difference can be overstated a bit, but and it's been a long time since I read that book, but it left quite an impression on me. But
No, I remember you saying how much you'd enjoyed it.
So I've been a bit cheeky, and I've got ChatGPT to summarize the difference.
You mean you've been to the Bodleian Library, Jack, and you've read it?
I've been to the Bodleian Library to review my primary sources, and I'm not 100% convinced by this, because I think it's something a bit more subtle, but the core contrast seems to be between essentially the ideal and the sensible. That for Plato, beauty was understood as something that really elevates reason. It's grounded in forms, in universals.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the way Burke sees beauty. I think Burke sees beauty as something that's highly particular. It's not necessarily in the sense of subjective, in that we can't have a common discourse about beauty, but certainly grounded in subjective experience and intersubjective experience, and grounded in the concreteness of things. So Burke's emphasis is more on the experiential, the psychological, sensation, emotion. Plato doesn't really speak much about emotion in connection with beauty, but that it's the appreciation of an objective, formal, determining component in an aesthetic way. But I guess what Burke is saying is that we haven't really said enough about, or positively incorporated, the emotional experience of beauty into our aesthetics. But as a consequence, he's then also tried to detach beauty from morality, from ethics.
Yeah.
So Burke's more inclined towards the view that beauty is morally neutral, whereas Plato is very much feels very strongly that beauty is an ethical problem. That all art partakes of ethical problems because of the way it affects and stirs us.
No, that is interesting, and he does take a warmth to the display of emotion, because I remember reading again that he was fond of getting very passionate in his speeches in the Commons, and he was known to cry openly in the Commons whilst engaging in something that really touched his soul in terms of a topic or a matter that was being discussed, and he would actually weep in the Commons.
Wow.
Which is, again, sort of something you wouldn't necessarily expect of a conservative sort of canon figure, would you? But
no,
but maybe
it's very
it relates.
beautiful. I didn't know that.
Yes, maybe it relates well into where we're going with the Romantic poets. But let's move on to yeah, I mean, we have a couple of options here, Jack. Would you like to perhaps explore a little further what he's doing in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, and how he's responding to those ideas that you were talking about with Richard Price?
Yes, certainly. So
yeah.
So Price basically gave a very long address to select members of the Whig Party, trying to persuade them toward this more Republican concept of what 1688 was all about. And he interpreted the Constitution as giving us the right to choose our electors and to cashier them for misconduct. And he connects this specifically with the king. So obviously, in that makes sense in connection with democracy, but what provisions are made for the king? Is the king another one of those electors who we can cashier for misconduct, in his phrase, or is the king some sort of distinct from the ordinary democratic process, and therefore connected to specific mechanisms of power?
Yeah.
distinct from the ordinary ones which we use to elect people. And Burke's interpretation is that it sounds quite polemic. It's that actually the English people must solemnly renounce their right for them and all their posterity to elect their rulers and consider them for misconduct. He prefers to view 1688 as essentially using the healthy members of the state to rectify the defunct member. So it wasn't about abandoning the monarchy. It wasn't about potentially instituting a republic. It was really about lawfully using the extant mechanisms of the state to lawfully rectify this problem, which was James II. So at the core of the dispute, I guess the nature of liberty, and how that is to be expressed politically. That makes up the first half of the book, more or less, or first third, if you like.
Yeah.
And then the attention shifts more towards the actual situation in France. And there, the common theme is that you cannot rationally plan a society.
Yeah.
Again, as we mentioned earlier, this is something Hayek picked up on as well. And he just systematically goes through in every detail, from the administrative problems to financial to military discipline, to sort of moral questions, all the mistakes that, in his view, the revolutionaries have made in trying to proceed with their project. For example, the way that they divide up the cantons in this purely geometric fashion, with no regard for the way resources are naturally distributed, and talents and culture and heritage and all of these things.
Which is very, very foreshadowing of things that would happen in the 20th century as well, in terms of, like, in the Soviet Union, the Gosplan and these kind of ideas of state economies that would somehow be able to grasp the diversity and variability of completely different regions, peoples, territories, and try and plan an economy and a political society from a central bastion out on a spoke mechanism to all of these different things, and try and, as you say, rationalize it to the supreme, when you just can't do that on the basis of how much is in flux and changing and how much difference there is across a territory.
Yes, exactly. So this is a central problem for modern politics, and it really originates, I think, in the French Revolution specifically. And there's so many threads to this. So, I mean, for instance, I find it quite funny to read it, because it makes me think of our own time. And you have a lot of people coming fresh-faced out of university trying to solve very big issues because they're very passionate about them. And this is sort of what the French Revolution was a bit like. A lot of young people who had received an education but had no practical experience, and they were all very fed up with the previous generations and the way that governance was found on hereditary principles rather than purely pedagogical ones. And all these mistakes seem to arise from a certain kind of hubris and a certain kind of ignorance and irreverence for tradition. And this is really what Burke honed in on.
And perhaps also the fact that they kind of they almost take up all the things that are bad about the previous regime, if you see what I mean, in the sense of the French revolutionaries take up basically the French imperial mantle, but do away with the monarchy, but maintain this kind of mammoth mantle that French imperialism had established, and keep it and how are you supposed to grapple? French revolutionaries at the same time are influenced by people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what was the main thing that Rousseau was saying? He was saying you can't have big states that function well. You need to have small, tiny states, break up big states and make them small, devolved power states. And they completely do away with that notion and maintain a mammoth, both domestically in France, but overseas as well, a mammoth expanse. Not only is that impractical, but also flies in the face of revolutionary principles, because Robespierre had said do away with slavery, but then when it comes to the actual implementation of the French revolutionary constitution, they maintain slavery. So these principles as well sort of seem to get warped by inheriting an imperial project, which Burke would be equally critical of as well, for this in the sense of its imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, as I said, a lot of this movement is founded in. I mean, of course, the reign of Louis XVI was not perfect, but but also, I mean, part of the problem with Louis XVI was that he really became a sacrificial victim for the reign of his father. I was recently told an anecdote by a friend. I think the last public execution? I don't know. There was quite an infamous public execution of the guy who tried to assassinate Louis XV, and he was he was hung, drawn, and quartered basically, and it went on for hours. And one of the aristocrats there writes in his diary, "We all came as monarchists and we all left as republicans." After that spectacle. So yeah, I mean, so there's obviously a lot of weight behind this, and economic mismanagement as well.
But Burke is so prophetic here, right? Because what we haven't mentioned is the fact that this isn't political journalism. This isn't looking at what's happening and saying, if we're not careful, this isn't looking at what's happening and saying, if we're not careful, this is what will happen in England. It's not that alone. He's saying, this is what I can see is going to happen in France, because this is published in 1790, right?
Yes.
The terror itself, the terror itself doesn't get started until 1793. Yes. So he knows what's coming.
No, indeed.
He is certainly guessing that that's what's going to come. But he's also using, I think, and we've discussed this before in podcasts and History of Ideas Club sessions, but he's also using his knowledge of history, because he is also looking back to other revolutions. Now, we were just saying that the Glorious Revolution obviously clouds this period, and who I look at in my research, Paul de Rapin, focuses on the sort of lead up to the Glorious Revolution and the establishment of the political parties, something which Burke himself also comments on in terms of this idea of a body of men united around some principles. Burke is also a contributor to this evolving need for political party to maintain stable democracies, but that's a side point. There's another revolution that sort of gets written out in many of its more ghastly elements of English history, which is, of course, the English Civil War, which isn't that long further back in recent history for these writers. And I'm sure Burke is looking back to that period and thinking, we see what comes. He might not have used the phrase, but the phrase that Professor Richard Watt Morris and Andrews uses is the rise of Caesar figures, people who promise the world, but actually want to only consolidate power for themselves. And of course, that was consolidated in the form of a Cromwell in England. And the Glorious Revolution doesn't lead to that, because obviously it's more to do with a kind of mixed constitution already. But pure revolutions that break away from the status quo result in Caesar figures. And I'm sure that is in his mind as well, looking at this revolution in France.
I'm sure, I from memory, I don't really recall him commenting at all on the English Civil War in that text. Maybe it was a sore point in English memory.
Exactly.
But indeed,
yeah.
It's probably where in part where his wisdom on the subject comes from. Sometimes it takes those who have gone, who have had this experience, and it's still in national memory, the reverberating consequences of this culturally and politically. to advise our friends overseas. Indeed, and also, I mean, some of the things you mentioned about like what would come in the future. I mean, you were already seeing the beginnings of some of that. Even as he was writing, because he had reports of regiments of the French military sort of running around the countryside, doing whatever they liked because the command structure was so weak.
Yeah.
Effectively because of the complete undermining of the principles of government by targeting this sort of figurehead of that in such a violent act. And so this is a core theme he returns to, and this is, I guess, the core, yes, idea thesis of the book, that you have a very important question to raise when you essentially reevaluate the principles of justice on which your society is founded. How are you going to measure the principles that you put in their place? So yeah, when you reconfigure the law at its roots, what determined the lawfulness of what you've created? To start afresh in this way, all kinds of questions ought to be answered, really. And this, the French in their haste did not do. It took them, so they spent a lot of time, I think, recovering as things were unfolding and trying to make sense of it all. And yeah, so it was difficult for them.
No, completely. And I think he does discuss the Civil War briefly, and I think he's wary of how these kind of revolutions can lead to military forms of dictatorship. And obviously, again, that's pretty prophetic, because who will ultimately become the Caesar figure of France out of the kind of long period of constitution? It's Napoleon.
Yeah.
So I think he's prophetic in that sense as well. I think, is there anything else you wanted to focus on when it came to Burke, Jack?
We could mention some of the sort of defining features of his conservatism. Which
maybe some bits around the
discussion.
skepticism of sort of pure democracy and these sort of things as well.
Yeah, indeed. And by pure democracy, you mean
sort of an unchecked power, a direct democracy, I guess.
A direct democracy. Yeah, exactly. So I think there are several elements that sort of go into that. So you've got to have reverence for the past and the institutions. He likens the state to a father whose wounds you tend to with care and affection, and with reverence. All these very descriptive morals, metaphors. There's this idea in Burke that those who have power ought to be strongly impressed with the idea that they act in trust, that they are held accountable for their conduct, ultimately to God, really. But certainly to their subjects. It's a very Christian idea that rulers are there to serve. And Burke takes this very seriously, and this is what he exhorts rulers to consider. So a ruler must be just, he must be virtuous, and that if you could impress that in office, or if you could impress that in people by virtue of their office, a lot of the challenges with governance would be ameliorated, and you wouldn't need recourse to a direct democracy with all of its imperfections. I mean, because in effect only is a short-term solution to political problems, I would suggest. Let's see. There's also
there was something interesting I can remember from the discussion around. It's a strange thing to say today, but he's a defender of prejudice, right? He's a defender of the idea that you shouldn't keep needing to recheck first principles. And
I have a great quote on this. He says, "We, the English, are not the converts of Rousseau. We are not the disciples of Voltaire. Helvetius has made no progress among us. Atheists are not our preachers. Madmen are not our lawgivers. We know that we have made no discoveries, and we think that no discoveries are to be made in morality, nor many in the great principles of government, nor in the ideas of liberty, which were well understood long before we were born. Altogether as well as they will be after the grave has heaped its mould upon our presumption, and the silent tomb shall have imposed its law on our pert loquacity." What a beautiful sentence. Wow. Give me such pleasure
Beautifully.
to read it. It
No.
goes on, but that's the idea. I mean, as far as Burke's concerned, I think one of the basic principles of a conservative vision is that there's not really that much that's new under the sun. There's nothing new to say or to discover.
It's
I
just
mean, you think
retelling,
about how,
rehashing of a retelling of already debated discussions and concepts, and whether it be in politics, whether it be in ethics, essentially these things have been well thought through over time. And why would we have any kind of almost right to fundamentally question them? Doesn't mean you can't engage in a discussion of them, but to actually need to keep going over them and fundamentally critiquing them seems a bit redundant almost to him.
yeah, I think it's well to criticize and to study something, but I, I guess one must have humility. One should not expect that one is going to find a fundamental error in the way we think about governance and liberty and
Yeah.
and authority.
Mm.
And that's not necessarily saying the way society is now is perfect. But
No,
if you
and he
look at
certainly advocates the kicking of the tires of many aspects of the political world. I guess he
yeah,
means more the fundamentals around how the state operates, how the
yeah,
political concepts that we've inherited from previous generations, they are not things that necessarily need to be rejustified or critiqued.
yeah, exactly. So on the one hand, you have theory, and we've been
Mm,
debating about politics for as long as we've been humans, really.
mm,
And you have such a wealth of material to read. I mean, basically, all of these problems were solved in classical time, with a few new problems that have emerged. I think with modernity,
Is that
which
you
sort
speaking, or is that Burke speaking?
I think that's something we share. I mean, that's to me that is the force of
Yeah.
the quote I read out. I mean, Burke is
Mm,
someone who has classical learning.
mm,
Um, it's evident in the way he writes, and
mm,
I,
mm,
I think that's the first thing you learn about. I'm very much enjoyed reading Thomas More's Utopia because it's a book that could have been written by someone in the 20th century or in the modern day,
mm.
talking all about capitalism and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
monopoly and sort of. I'm interpolating these words, but the basic problems he's wrestling with are what we would talk about as public and private property and
Yeah.
monopoly and distribution of wealth and welfare. All of these things. This is
Mm,
exactly what the book is about. Um, and beneath that is uh, a very prudent and and pertinent discourse on the role of reason in constructing society, much like what Burke is calling into question.
yeah.
Um, so in terms of theory, everything's already been written more or less, with some exceptions.
Well, that's
Sometimes there
good.
are there are sometimes some I mean, I think, and for instance, I do think that the direction that society is taking, where the businesses and the corporations are very
Mm,
much taking over and
yeah.
superseding governments in their power. I mean, is it radically new? Maybe someone would dispute that, but I think this does feel somewhat new to the technocracy, let's call it. Or
Mm,
um, anyway, that's an aside. Um, in practice, Burke also does advocate this kind of reverence because obviously the institutions haven't come out of nowhere, but decisions have been made because problems arose and
yeah.
there were debates and judgments. And the easiest thing in the world is to assume that everything that our present situation is a consequence of carelessness and stupidity. It's probably not. It's that the problem is that in governance, one always has to make compromises and sacrifices.
Mm.
And so Burke's sort of advocating sort of more of a human factor to governance. Our
And
governments are not.
which comes back to, and something that then links to an episode we'll obviously be recording later, but Scruton, this idea of moral imagination as well.
Mm,
The idea
mm,
of all of these elements which are irrational, contributing towards the effectiveness and the good state, I guess. whether it be the church, the aristocracy, the monarchy, these things, that
Yeah, the
reason
differences in
alone,
language, the cultures, everything.
and reason alone cannot design a functioning society, but the stable traditions emerge through those irrational institutions, the not fundamentally rational traditions, and historical experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Burke's conservatism is very much one that looks to sort of the local level first and works its way up,
Yeah.
to understand a situation, to understand why people think a certain way, what their political ambitions are, and so forth. A purely abstract critique is not persuasive for Burke, because it's indifferent to concrete matter, and concrete matter
Yeah.
actually is determinate in policy. Finally, just to sort of mention, or to elaborate on what we mentioned earlier, Burke's idea of society as a contract, between, or not in the sense of the Enlightenment, right? The other Enlightenment writers as something that can be. I mean, let me just read the quote out. It's really nice. Society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfections. As the end of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Because understanding the world we're in involves, in his fate, a partnership of all science, all art, every virtue, and all perfection. It requires the wisdom of the age. It requires history. It requires all industry and learning. We're in debt to the past, and we bear responsibility to the future.
Yeah. Well, Jack, talking about the future, I think what we may need to do, looking at the time and having listened out and heard the door close, which makes me think that Dr. Jones is here for my tutorial, talking about the future, I think we may need to record a second episode for this session, moving on to the Romantics, because we've covered Burke in good length. We've been on this call for over an hour. So I reckon that people will have had their fill of Burke, but we'll have to wait in anticipation for a session on the Romantics. But we can do that relatively soon and get that uploaded simultaneously. Do you think that's a good plan?
Yeah, I think that would be perfect.
Perfect, because I only have a few minutes until my tutorial will begin, and I'll be discussing 18th century thinkers also. But I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of Edmund Burke. Jack, thank you very much indeed for walking us through it. That was really, really interesting, and I think we covered a lot of ground on his thinking, from everything from the Sublime through to his reflections on the Revolution. So, thank you, Jack.
Okay, and thank you, Sam.
You can, no worries at all, and you can wait in anticipation for our session on the Romantics. So, thank you very much indeed.
Great.